shocking beyond belief when police forced open a locked room in a wealthy French home. What they found was not a ghost story, but a living nightmare. A once beautiful young woman, chained to 25 years of darkness and silence, hidden by her own family. This is the true horror of Blanche Monnier. Stay until the end, and do not forget to like this video and subscribe. When the shutters of the Monnier house were finally forced open, the smell escaped first. It drifted into the narrow street like something alive, a stench that clung to the air and settled in the lungs of those who dared breathe it. The neighbors watched as the police climbed the staircase, their boots echoing in a place that had been silent for decades. Behind a locked door, sealed for more than 20 years, they found her. She was no longer the young woman whose beauty had once been whispered about in drawing rooms and salons. What they uncovered was something frail, skeletal, her skin clinging to her bones, her hair a tangled mass, her eyes blinded by the sudden intrusion of light. Blanche Monnier was alive, but she was not the woman she had been. She had been forgotten, starved, left in filth and darkness for a quarter of a century. The officers froze at the sight, unable to speak at first. They could only stare at the figure before them, a woman reduced to something that looked less than human. She whispered words that made little sense, her voice so weak it was barely a sound. Her hands trembled as if the simple act of raising them to shield her eyes was too great a burden. The sheets beneath her were stained, the air heavy with rot and decay. This was not a crime scene discovered in the wilderness, nor in a dungeon carved into stone. This was the heart of a respectable home, a house that belonged to one of the most well-regarded families of the town. For years, the shutters had stayed closed. For years, excuses had been offered, polite lies spoken to curious neighbors. For years, Blanche's absence had been explained away with silence, until people stopped asking. And now the truth lay before them, grotesque and undeniable. She had not vanished. She had not run away. She had been here all along, behind walls too familiar to be questioned. The family had lived their lives, entertained guests, shared meals, while behind one locked door, their daughter and sister withered in darkness. What kind of mind could allow such cruelty to continue? What kind of heart could listen to the faint cries through a door and choose to ignore them? How many visitors had walked past that very room, unaware of the breathing corpse only a few feet away? Blanche Monnier had once been admired, once loved, once promised a life like any other. Instead, she had become the ghost inside her own home. The discovery of Blanche was not only the unearthing of one woman's suffering. It was the revelation of a family secret so dark that even the police who uncovered it would never forget what they saw. She had lived through 25 years of silence, every hour stretching into an eternity of hunger, despair, and isolation. And when her story was revealed, it forced an entire nation to ask a question that still lingers. Like the smell that first escaped from that locked room. How could a family do this? And how could no one else have stopped them? The year was the late 19th century, a period in France when social standing carried more weight than compassion, when the facade of respectability could conceal almost anything. In the provincial town of Poitiers, where cobblestone streets echoed with the rhythm of carriage wheels and the murmur of polite society, the Monnier family held an enviable place. They were known for their wealth, their refinement, and their adherence to tradition. Behind their grand facade, trimmed hedges, and carefully polished windows, few would have imagined that a darkness was slowly taking root within the walls of their home. Blanche Monnier had once been the jewel of the family, admired for her beauty, spoken of with reverence in gatherings, and regarded as a young woman destined for a prosperous match. Her dark hair and delicate features caught the eye of many suitors, and whispers suggested that her presence alone could elevate a family's fortune. In the polite yet ruthless circles of 19th century France, such things mattered more than affection or personal desire. She was not simply a daughter or a sister, she was a symbol, a vessel upon which the family's reputation was to be secured. Society during that era was rigid. A young woman's choices were not her own. She was expected to marry within her station, to uphold the honor of her bloodline, and to silence any thoughts or desires that clashed with her family's ambition. Appearances were everything, and scandal was an unforgivable sin. Behind smiles, handshakes, and evening dances, there existed an unspoken fear, the fear of disgrace. To the Monniers, reputation was not only precious, it was sacred. And it was this obsession that would eventually cost Blanche her freedom. There were moments in Blanche's early life that painted her not as a symbol, but as a human being. She was described as intelligent, kind, and strong-willed. She admired literature and beauty beyond the confines of money and titles. She longed, as many young women do, for affection that came from truth rather than arrangement. But in her household, where appearances weighed more heavily than the truth, her desires threatened the fragile architecture of control her mother and brother carefully maintained. It was in these years, before her disappearance, that subtle tensions began to show. Neighbors noticed the controlling nature of her mother, a woman of sharp presence and unyielding authority. Blanche's brother, too, was known for his fierce loyalty to his mother's will. Within the house, the hierarchy was clear. Blanche's opinions, her wants, her very identity mattered only as long as they aligned with the desires of her family. Anything beyond it was viewed as betrayal. When Blanche expressed her intention to marry a man who did not meet her family's standard, a man seen as beneath her station, it was more than disobedience. It was war against the very foundation upon which the Monniers had built their place in society. The fear of ridicule, the whispers of neighbors, the imagined shame that could fall upon their name, all of it burned like fire in the heart of her mother. To most, it would have been a matter of disagreement, perhaps even estrangement. But within the walls of the Monnier house, it became something else entirely. It became the spark that would ignite decades of hidden cruelty. As the town of Poitiers continued with its daily rhythms. As men argued politics in cafes and women tended to their homes, Blanche Monnier's fate was already shifting toward silence. Her beauty, once a blessing, became the justification for control. Her spirit, once admired, was twisted into rebellion in the eyes of those who demanded obedience. And slowly, the world she knew began to close in on her. This was the backdrop of her story. A society where appearances ruled, a family bound by obsession with honor, and a young woman whose only crime was the desire to choose her own life. In such a world, love could become a sentence, and disobedience could lead not to exile, but to imprisonment. The stage was set, the roles already written. Long before the shutters of the Monnier house were locked for the last time, Blanche Monnier's absence came quietly, like a candle snuffed out in a room where no one wished to admit there had ever been light. At first, her disappearance was explained in careful tones. She was unwell, said her mother. She was resting, said her brother. Those who knew her, or thought they did, accepted these words because they came from the Monniers, a family beyond reproach. In a society where reputation was a shield, no one dared pierce the veil. Weeks passed, then months, and when questions arose about why Blanche had not been seen at social gatherings, excuses were offered again. It was said she had retreated from public life. It was said she had grown too delicate for society. It was said she had chosen solitude. The words shifted with time, but they were always delivered with the same tone of authority, designed to silence doubt before it could grow. But doubt did grow. Some neighbors noticed that Blanche's windows, once filled with sunlight, had been shuttered without explanation. The heavy curtains never shifted, no matter the season. Others whispered that servants carried trays into the upper floors at odd hours, though no guests were ever announced. At night, faint sounds could be heard, muffled and fleeting, as if carried by the walls themselves. A laugh too weak to be joyful, a cry too faint to be acknowledged. These moments unsettled the few who heard them, but no one spoke openly. The Monniers were respected, and in such a world, respect was enough to bury suspicion. The years slipped by in silence. Blanche's name was spoken less often, until it belonged only to memory. Yet every so often, her absence resurfaced in hushed tones. A passer-by would remember the beauty she once carried, the promise she once held, and wonder why such a woman had faded so completely from the world. There were those who speculated she had left town, perhaps to escape a life she no longer wanted. Others imagined scandal a secret pregnancy, a forbidden romance, a choice that had forced her into exile. Theories grew in the absence of truth, but truth itself remained locked behind doors no one dared open. As time deepened the mystery, contradictions began to bleed through. Servants were dismissed suddenly and without explanation. Tradesmen complained of deliveries that did not make sense. Extra food, yet fewer gatherings. Endless supplies of coal for rooms that were never open to guests. Some noticed the smell, faint at first, an odor that lingered at the edge of the Monnier property, dismissed as the fault of drains or animals. But to those who paid attention, it carried the unmistakable weight of neglect, the sour note of decay. Still, no one acted. The house stood proud while Blanche's existence became a shadow. Children grew to adults who had never seen her face, yet heard stories of her beauty as if she were a figure from folklore. The Monniers themselves carried on with cold precision, their wealth and reputation untouched, their daily routines unbroken. The facade was perfect, but beneath it, something unspeakable was being sustained. A secret so fragile it depended on silence, and so grotesque that silence alone allowed it to thrive. Every locked shutter, every unanswered question, every polite smile from her mother was another brick in the wall of Blanche's prison. And with each passing year, the absence hardened into something more disturbing. For if she had left, why had no letters arrived? If she had chosen solitude, why was there no trace of her life beyond those walls? If she had died, why was there no grave? The questions were simple, yet they remained unanswered, and that silence became more terrifying than any answer could have been. The world outside moved forward, new fashions arrived. Wars were fought. Lives began and ended, while inside that house, time stopped. Blanche was alive, but no one could see her. She was suffering, but no one dared intervene. And in that quiet absence, a mystery grew so vast it swallowed the memory of the young woman she had once been. Blanche Monnier had not vanished. She had been erased, slowly, carefully, deliberately, until even those who once loved her believed she had become nothing more than a rumor got the truth. Long buried beneath silence and excuses, began to surface in the most unexpected of ways. It was not the neighbors, nor the servants, nor the friends who once adored Blanche, who brought her suffering into the light. It was a letter, anonymous, unsigned, a simple slip of paper that arrived in the hands of the Parisian police. Its words were stark, stripped of pretense, and damning in their simplicity. It claimed that a woman had been locked away in the Monnier residence for many years. It claimed that she was being kept against her will, starving, living in filth, hidden from the world. There was no request for attention, no embellishment, only the weight of undeniable accusation that at first, authorities hesitated. The Monniers were not an ordinary family. They were respected, even feared, their wealth and reputation woven into the very structure of local society. To question them was to invite scrutiny, and few dared to do so. Yet the letter lingered. It carried the uneasy tone of truth, the kind of detail that could not have been invented without knowledge of something hidden. And so, reluctantly, investigators were sent to the house. What they found in their approach was unsettling, even before the door was opened. The shutters were nailed tight, the curtains drawn, the windows layered with dust as though light itself had been banished. The smell reached them in the courtyard, faint but undeniable, an odor that should not have seeped from the home of a family so wealthy and polished. Servants met them at the door with practiced calm, but their eyes betrayed unease. When the officers demanded entry to the upper floors, hesitation filled the hall. Excuses were offered, polite refusals framed as protection of privacy. Yet the letter had already poisoned the air with suspicion, and the officers pressed forward. Testimony gathered later revealed cracks in the story that had held for decades. Servants admitted to carrying trays of food upstairs, but they had never seen the one who consumed them. Neighbors spoke of noises in the night, cries too faint to be mistaken for anything but human. Some recalled the putrid smell that drifted from the home, though they had convinced themselves it must have come from waste pipes or animals left to rot in the yard. Each piece was small, insignificant in isolation, but together they painted a portrait of deliberate concealment. Theories emerged even before the door was forced open. Psychologists later suggested the Monniers were driven by obsession, a pathological need to preserve control at any cost. Others argued that it was less madness than cold calculation, a decision born from fear of scandal. Blanche had chosen love over duty, and for that choice, her family believed she deserved punishment. Whether it was obsession or cruelty, the result was the same. She was locked away, her existence reduced to silence, her suffering hidden behind the facade of respectability. The longer investigators examined the fragments, the clearer it became that the entire community had participated in her captivity through silence. They had smelled the rot. They had heard the cries. They had noticed the drawn shutters and the odd deliveries. Yet no one had spoken until the anonymous letter forced their hand. In this way, the letter became not only evidence, but accusation. It revealed not only the crime of a family, but the crime of a society that preferred to protect appearances rather than confront the unthinkable. And when the officers stood before the locked door, letter in hand, they already knew what they would find. They knew because the clues had always been there, scattered like whispers across the years. They knew because the silence was too heavy, too carefully constructed. The only question left was how much of Blanche remained after 25 years of darkness. When the officers broke down the door, the room itself seemed to recoil. Heavy shutters blocked every trace of daylight. The air was thick with rot, and the heat pressed down like a suffocating hand. At the center of that darkness, Blanche lay curled on her filthy bedding, her form more shadow than flesh. Her body had withered, her limbs frail and twisted from years without movement. Her skin was pale, mottled, clinging tightly to bone, her hair matted into long ropes that clung to her shoulders. She tried to speak, but her words were fragments, barely sounds, the voice of someone who had forgotten the rhythm of human conversation. Her eyes, blinded by the sudden burst of light, watered as she shielded her face. The officers stood frozen, not only at the sight of her condition, but at the realization that this had been sustained for more than 2 decades. It was not a moment of discovery. It was a moment of reckoning. Blanche's suffering had not been only physical. The long years in isolation had carved into her mind with the same cruelty that hunger had carved into her body. In her captivity, time had lost its shape. Days had blurred into nights. Years had collapsed into an endless present of hunger, darkness, and silence. She had lived with the gnawing terror of abandonment, the despair of hope extinguished and reignited with every footstep outside her door. She had whispered to herself in the silence, her own voice the only proof she still existed. The room had become her world, and the world had become a prison. The betrayal was the most unbearable wound of all. The people who had sworn to protect her own mother, her own brother, had been her jailers. Each meal they delivered was not an act of care, but a reminder of their control. Each passing day was not survival, but punishment prolonged. The same hands that could have opened the door had kept it locked. She had been told, silently and brutally, that her choice to love a man outside her family's approval was not only disobedience, but a crime that required the erasure of her life. And so she learned that her identity was no longer her own. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a sister, no longer a woman with desires. She was only a secret, and secrets had to be hidden. The community, once confronted with the truth, found themselves haunted by guilt. They remembered the strange smells, the shuttered windows, the absence that stretched too long. They remembered dismissing whispers, silencing suspicion, choosing not to see what had been before them. It was easier to believe the lie of a family too respectable to commit such cruelty. It was easier to turn away from discomfort than to face the possibility that such horror could grow in their midst. And when the truth emerged, it was not only the Monnier household that was indicted, but the entire town that had kept silent. For Blanche, the release came too late. Though the door had been opened, the damage was beyond repair. She had been reduced to something fragile, her body unable to recover from decades of neglect, her mind scarred by endless isolation. Even sunlight, once a comfort, had become unbearable. Freedom did not restore her. It only exposed the depth of what she had lost. Every hour of her confinement had been stolen, every moment of laughter or love erased. She was alive, but she had been stripped of the very years that made life worth living. Her story became a mirror held up to those who looked upon her. It forced people to confront what cruelty can be when it is disguised as duty, when family becomes captor, and when society chooses to remain blind. Blanche Monnier's tragedy was not only the years she spent in darkness, but the silence that allowed it to continue. Her pain lingered in the faces of those who had once known her, and it spread through the whispers of strangers who struggled to comprehend what they had allowed to exist beside them. She had been betrayed by blood, abandoned by neighbors, and devoured by time. And in that, her suffering was complete. The investigation that followed was not only an inquiry into a crime, but an attempt to explain the inexplicable. Blanche Monnier had been rescued, but the question that echoed louder than her cries was why. Why had her own family locked her away for 25 years? Why had a mother, a brother, protectors by blood and duty, chosen to become her captors? The authorities sifted through testimony, collected statements, and listened to the murmurs of servants, neighbors, and witnesses. What they pieced together was not a simple story of cruelty, but a web of motives that shifted like shadows, never offering a single answer. The most common explanation was control. Blanche had fallen in love with a man her family considered unworthy, a suitor without wealth or standing, someone whose union with her would tarnish the Monnier name. In a society where reputation was fragile and honor was currency, her choice was viewed not as love, but as betrayal. Her mother, a woman described as unyielding and consumed with family pride, believed that Blanche's disobedience endangered the very foundation of their place in society. What began as punishment for defiance became, over time, a permanent sentence. Some argued that it was not cruelty for its own sake, but a twisted belief that locking her away would preserve the family's dignity. Yet to believe that honor could justify decades of suffering was a horror in itself. Others pointed to obsession. Blanche's mother, known for her domineering nature, may have viewed her daughter as an extension of herself, a possession to be controlled, molded, and silenced when she refused obedience. Blanche's brother, who remained complicit throughout, was described as deeply devoted to his mother, his will bending entirely to hers. Investigators questioned whether his loyalty had become blindness, whether he had convinced himself that his sister's suffering was necessary, even righteous. The psychological grip of one personality dominating an entire household became a theory in itself. Perhaps Blanche had not been imprisoned by a family, but by a single woman's obsession, enforced by a son too weak to resist. There were whispers of darker motives still. Some speculated that money had played a role. Keeping Blanche confined ensured control over her dowry, her inheritance, her independence. Others suggested that the imprisonment had become a habit, a secret too great to release once it had begun. To free her after so many years would have been to admit the crime, and so the years compounded, each one deepening the silence until there could be no escape without exposure. In this view, Blanche was not only a victim of cruelty, but of time itself, her captivity sustained not by purpose, but by fear of discovery. The official inquiry condemned the Monniers, but even condemnation felt incomplete. The law could name the crime, but it could not fully explain it. When the public learned of Blanche's condition, outrage swept through France. Newspapers described the horror in graphic detail, painting Blanche as the martyr of a family's madness and society's silence. Yet even in their words, there was unease. The case unsettled because it could not be contained within the boundaries of reason. No explanation, control, obsession, pride, or greed seemed sufficient to account for 25 years of calculated neglect. The trial raised more questions than it answered. Was Blanche's mother a monster, or a woman so warped by the weight of reputation that she convinced herself her actions were justified? Was her brother guilty of equal cruelty, or was he a coward consumed by loyalty, unable to break free from his mother's influence? Theories multiplied, but none could explain the endurance of such cruelty. The way it had been hidden behind shutters and silence, while an entire community looked away. In the end, the investigation produced facts, but no true resolution. The facts revealed the mechanics of the crime, who locked the door, who carried the keys, who enforced the silence, but they did not touch the deeper truth. They did not explain how a human being could hear the cries of their own flesh and blood and respond with indifference. They did not explain how neighbors could pass the house each day, hear the faint sounds of suffering, and bury them beneath gossip and convenience. They did not explain how 25 years of darkness could exist in the midst of ordinary life. The theories were many, but the answers remained hollow, leaving only the weight of unease. The knowledge that the cruelty of the Monnier family was both extraordinary and terrifyingly human. Blanche Monnier's release should have marked an ending, but it did not. The door had been broken, the room opened, the world allowed to see what had been hidden for 25 years. Yet what emerged was not deliverance, but a wound that could never heal. Blanche was free, but she was no longer the woman she had once been. Her body had been stolen by hunger, her spirit carved hollow by darkness, her mind frayed by endless solitude. She stepped back into the world as a survivor, but also as a monument to cruelty, a living reminder of what silence can permit. Freedom arrived too late. The years had already been devoured, but her story did not fade quietly. It spread like fire across France, igniting outrage, horror, fascination. Newspapers detailed every grotesque element: the stench of the room, the matted hair, the skeletal frame that trembled beneath soiled sheets. People read with disbelief, yet could not look away. They wanted to understand, but the deeper they searched, the more unsettling the truth became. Because what had happened to Blanche was not an accident. It was not sudden violence. It was patience, deliberate and methodical, cruelty stretched across decades. And that was what terrified people most. Evil that endured quietly, shielded by shutters, allowed to grow in plain sight. The Monnier family became symbols of monstrosity, but they were also mirrors. Their actions forced others to question how such cruelty could exist undetected. The townspeople who had smelled the rot, who had heard the muffled cries, who had noticed the absence, found themselves haunted by complicity. They had built the silence as surely as the mother and brother had built the prison. And beyond Poitiers, others wondered how many doors remained closed in their own streets, how many secrets hidden by reputation and respectability were rotting just beyond reach. Blanche's story did not belong only to one family. It belonged to every community that chooses blindness over confrontation. What lingered most was not the spectacle of her suffering, but the unanswered question of why. Why had her own mother turned punishment into lifelong imprisonment? Why had her brother followed, year after year, without mercy? Why had no one intervened? Theories were offered, explanations constructed, but none could carry the full weight of the horror. In the end, Blanche's suffering remained greater than any attempt to explain it. Her story became less about understanding cruelty and more about acknowledging that some acts resist comprehension. Even after her rescue, Blanche lived out her days in fragile silence. She had been too long in darkness to truly return to the light. Those who saw her spoke of her eyes, how they seemed fixed not on the world before her, but on the endless night behind her. She had endured what few could imagine, and though her body was present, part of her remained in that locked room, tethered to the years stolen from her dot, and so, the story of Blanche Monnier endures not because it closed, but because it never truly did. It forces us to look at the fragility of trust, the cruelty that can thrive in ordinary homes, the way silence can become an accomplice. It whispers that evil does not always arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it waits behind shutters in darkness, feeding on the willingness of others to turn away. Even now, the question lingers like the smell that first escaped her room. How many doors remain locked? How many lives remain hidden? How many secrets are preserved not by force, but by silence? The story does not end with Blanche's rescue. It ends with us, asking whether we would have listened to the faint cries, or whether we too would have walked past the house and pretended not to hear. If Blanche's story unsettled you, leave a like to help others uncover it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe horrors like this still happen behind closed doors? And subscribe to the channel for more stories that bring the shadows into the light. There are still doors waiting to be opened.